what was going on over the summer. So I think we thought it'd be quite useful to give you a bit of a recap, talk about what's happening. Sorry, I think you might have missed the start. So yeah, just to say welcome to our webinar. My name is Chris Walker. I work in NCVO's external relations team. Quite a lot is happening over the summer, and so I think we thought it would be useful to give you a bit of a recap in terms of what's been going on with negotiations and what might happen in Parliament if a deal is agreed and we go through. So just to introduce us, as I said, I'm Chris Walker. I lead on our parliamentary activity here at NCVO. So I'll be talking a little bit about what happens if a deal is brought to Parliament and some of the challenges there. And my colleague Ben will be talking about what's happening on the EU side, what's happening with negotiations. Just a little bit about the webinar. So we're going to start with a 30-minute presentation, and then we will have 15 minutes Q&A after that. So please, as we go along, if you're typing your questions into the panel, if there's anything that kind of comes up that you're particularly interested in, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. And once we have finished, we will send you a short follow-up survey, so you can let us know what you liked about the webinar, and if there's anything we can do to improve. So with that, I will hand over to Ben to talk about the negotiations.
Thanks very much. So first things first, we are going to start off with a poll, and we'd like to ask you the hot question at the moment, really, which is what do you think is going to happen? What the most likely outcome of Brexit is, which is obviously the thing that's being discussed the most in the media. So we've got 5 options. The first is the Chequers proposal, the proposal that the government's following, and that's currently being touted by the Prime Minister to the EU. The second is some vague agreement on the future relationship. That is to say, some kind of last-minute deal whereby we negotiate most of the future relationship during a hypothetical transition period. The third is a Canada-style agreement, CETA, which follows the model that Canada currently has with the EU. The fourth, EFTA, European Free Trade Agreement. And the fifth, of course, the one being talked about very much in the news, is no deal. So it'll be interesting to see what you think about that. So the results are in. We've got a very, very interesting 2-horse race between a blind Brexit, so some vague agreement, and no deal. So it seems that your confidence in the government's current plan seems low. Obviously, we'll touch on what those two mean as we go through. So I'm going to talk you through what's happened over the summer, what the possibilities are, what the likely scenarios are, and what the implications are. First things first is that over the summer, obviously, we've had lots and lots of press coverage over what's been going on. And the first thing to say is that there's only really been 2 concrete things that have happened over the summer. The first is that the withdrawal agreement announcement, the summit at which that will be announced, has been delayed. We had October in the diary and it's been put back to November. There's a summit in December, which is a kind of fallback option if an agreement's not made by November. But the current aim for the government is to have a withdrawal agreement agreed and announced by November so that Parliament can vote on something. And the second, of course, as you would have seen in the news, is the release of a series of technical notices which are drawn up by the government in order to advise various paths of life on no deal preparations, so industry, people, and it's always worth looking at those because there's a lot of indications to what the government's doing in those. So the Chequers plan, the current proposal, this is what the government is currently working with. It was agreed and made into a white paper after the now infamous meeting at Chequers. And the white paper was released in early July, and it focuses on 4 areas: economic partnership, security, cooperation, and of course the future relationship with the EU. It's no secret that there's been a lot of anger over this deal, and so I'm just going to look at what the most contentious bits are and what the detail that's angering people is. The proposals are an attempt at what Theresa May is calling a pragmatic Brexit. She's recognised that we need to compromise a bit more with the EU, and so she's attempting to be pragmatic. She's softened her stance a little bit, and in taking over negotiations from Dex EU, from Dominic Raab, she has taken pretty much personal responsibility along with the Cabinet Office for the negotiations. So it's very much her Brexit, this, or at least her vision for Brexit. And before I go on, it's also worth noting that through this, it's the UK position that's likely to change through the negotiations, as we are the one bringing this proposal to the table. So the contentious bits. The first is on goods. A free trade area with a common rule book is what's being proposed. What that basically means is, in all but name, single market membership for goods. And it would see the UK taking on EU rules and regulations on goods. Without us accepting those, the paper understands that frictionless trade isn't possible. So that's the kind of grounding on which they're looking to negotiate some kind of deal on goods. The second is on customs, and you would have read a lot in the press about the facilitated customs arrangement being proposed. This would basically see the UK collecting tariffs on behalf of the EU at the UK borders, and then obviously giving them back to the EU. And the idea with this is that it allows the UK to strike its own trade deals around the world. I'll come back to that this particular bit later, but it's clear already that the FCA is already pretty much dead in the water. It's been scrapped, it's been rubbished, sorry, by both the UK and the EU. The third is agencies, and the UK seeking to participate in EU agencies. This is particularly important. We want to be in things like European medicine agencies and the aviation agencies, which means accepting ECJ, European Court of Justice rulings, which has obviously angered a lot of Brexiteers because they feel that we should be sovereign and that the ECJ is absolutely a European thing and shouldn't be something that has jurisdiction over the UK. Worth saying immediately, the European Medicines Agency has cut Britain out of many contracts already and moved its EMA HQ out of London, and we've also been cut out of the Galileo space programme for security reasons. So again, that's been met with disdain from the EU in some parts. The last bit is on services. The UK is very, very strong on services. We run a surplus on services. It accounts for a large part of our economy, and we are banking on the fact that the City of London is traditionally a strong financial powerhouse. We're banking on its importance being to the EU being such that we can get some kind of looser deal with the EU on that. And again, those are things which are the kind of headlines from the paper which have caused consternation. The last thing to mention really is on people. The white paper doesn't directly mention the rights of EU citizens. A second white paper came out afterwards which does commit to the rights of existing EU citizens, and it talks about a new immigration system which will be outlined in a white paper in due course. That's been delayed several times already, but we are told that it will be on its way. The Migration Committee needs to meet and do an economic analysis, after which we will be given some kind of system for immigration. Always worth saying really that the EU is probably not going to back down on this. It's very wary that its own rules-based immigration system is under threat from the world of Trump and the populism of various countries around Europe, and so it's not willing to bend on that. So the rights of EU nationals, therefore, from the UK point of view, remains fairly uncertain. We've had some pledges, which I'll come back to later. So that's the paper. That's the government's current negotiating plan. I'm now just going to take us through what the reaction's been. And obviously, it's no secret again that the reaction's been pretty bad. In the UK, we've had a very, very seismic upheaval in the government. We've had 10 resignations. We've obviously had Boris Johnson resign. We've had David Davis resign. We've had Steve Baker resign, and a load of Conservative ministers and vice chairs of the party have quit over the Brexit plan. They're calling it Brexit in name only. Essentially, they think it's too soft a Brexit. It concedes too much to the EU. It doesn't allow us to take control of our borders and all the things talked about during the referendum campaign. So pretty much straight away after the white paper was released, we had a vote on the customs bill, which went through Parliament, and the ERG, the European Research Group, which is headed by the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg, added some amendments to that bill, and the government had to back down on them because consternation within the Conservative Party is such that the government can't bank on those votes, which of course led the Labour Party to suggest that the white paper is in tatters. We've had a load more reaction from around kind of Parliament, around Westminster. Boris Johnson in the last week has described the white paper as a disaster for Brexit. David Davis has called it worse than staying in, and he'll do anything to stop the plan. There's a poll on Conservative Home this week, which is quite interesting, because it polls members of the Conservative Party, and it came out that they are overwhelmingly against Theresa May's Chequers plan, which is why obviously it's good to see that everyone is aware from the poll earlier that the Chequers plan looks pretty unlikely. What this has done, obviously, is give rise to the no deal talk coming back. So we've got the government. It's always good to look at what government slogans are being touted in the age of slogan politics. So no deal is better than a bad deal. No deal wouldn't be the end of the world. We're hearing lots of this from the government, so it's always worth noting that. From the EU side, we've had a similarly negative reaction. Michel Barnier this week has said that he's strongly opposed to the Chequers proposal. Angela Merkel in Germany has been briefing German finance chiefs about talks collapsing. We've had the French Europe minister saying that the plans are unacceptable. We've got various noises from around the continent essentially saying that British plans are making no deal likelier. So again, the EU is committed to the four freedoms, which seem incompatible with the paper. It's fairly clear that the paper is not in line with the EU's interests. And so the EU has circulated to its own, the EU27, a preparedness paper, which is a paper looking at ways in which member nations can prepare for a no-deal Brexit. It's something that is now very much on the radar of the EU member states. So lots and lots of negative outcomes so far from the government's Chequers proposal. What does that mean then? What are the possible outcomes? I'm just going to look at a couple of outcomes that are left available to the government at this point. And I'll talk very briefly about what they mean. The first is high alignment. This is the closest thing we've got to the pragmatic Brexit that Theresa May is after. She wants no tariffs. It would mean that. It would mean frictionless borders. It would mean harmonisation with EU rules on regulated industries. And in the short term, it would probably be good for UK business because it would protect us from some of the immediate economic impacts. In the long term, of course, we won't be able to contribute to rules on customs around the continent, so we might therefore see rules start to be set up in a way that don't benefit British business anymore. So high alignment now, given the reaction to the Chequers plan, seems quite unlikely. Low alignment, or Canada Plus Plus, or CETA, all of these things have so many names, seems now likely. It was what David Davis was looking at originally, which Parliament wasn't keen on at first, but now has kind of reared its head again, and essentially is customs with increased costs and negotiated market access per market. Then, of course, there is no deal Brexit, which is something, as I said, that's being touted more and more at the moment. Certainly the likelihood has risen since the Chequers paper was put out. This means access to EU markets as if we were a third country. Mark Carney has described the prospect of it as uncomfortably high. The government is obviously publishing the technical notifications about it. It pledged money in the budget last year, $3 billion to look at no deal preparations across government. And the last is European fudge, which is the other thing that came up in the poll, which is some kind of deal being done before March, presumably on the necessary things like aviation, medicine, and stuff like that, which then takes us into a transition period, and we negotiate during a transition period. Although, if that was the case and we'd left and would go negotiating after that point, the UK would be negotiating as a third country. The last option, of course, is to hold another referendum, and I think Chris is going to touch on that a bit later. And this is just a very quick infographic from the Institute of Government on your screens, which is quite a nice visual demonstration of the complexities of what has to be done in terms of negotiation, getting it through Parliament, whether there's a deal, whether there's not a deal, and all the iterations of that. It's very, very nice way of looking at just how complicated the process is from here on out. What's left to be settled? Well, the EU is saying that there is 80% of the deal left to be complete, and 20% is left to be settled. It sounds quite a long way along. However, it's always worth noting that the remaining 20% is full of flashpoints. It's full of very, very difficult things. There is data protection and the sharing of criminal records. There's what happens to Gibraltar administratively. There's what happens to Ireland, which has of course been a thing all along, which has certainly threatened to destabilise talks. There's UK military bases in Cyprus. There's who should police the withdrawal agreements. There's a great deal left, and of course there's the right to be EU nationals in the UK. And the EU has concerns particularly about low-skilled workers in the UK. Then of course there is something that is not in the EU's hands, but will Parliament pass any deal? Again, that's full of complexity, and Chris is going to come on to that later. And obviously the political uncertainty and the internal splits within parties is making that more and more difficult to look at. It is worth noting though that in the last 24 hours we believe there's been a little bit of progress in talks between the UK and Germany, and we've seen a rise in the pound against the euro and the dollar as a result of that. The EU is basically willing to offer Theresa May what they're kind of calling a carrot and stick approach. That is, they're going to offer her warm words about the Chequers deal, which she can take to Tory party conference, but then they will really needle her, particularly on the Ireland issue. So lastly, I'm just going to look very quickly at what this means for charities. It's really important that charities are planning now, because we are very much in the final few months before Brexit, particularly with the possibility of no deal. It's important to be looking to the future. We need to be looking at funding options, at the options for people in the workforce, particularly looking at the technical notices, because they give a good deal of what life might be like in the case of no deal. So we've had some pledges. The Treasury has pledged to underwrite European structural funds. Successful bids into EU funds will be underwritten by the government in the event of no deal. Again, that's all in the technical notices. And so what's really important for charities is that they continue to bid into EU funds, because if they are successful in getting into them before March, then the government has pledged to continue providing that money. So in many ways, the worst thing a charity can do is to not carry on bidding into EU funds. We have also had some pledges on citizens' rights. EU nationals, we've heard that their rights will be protected in the meantime. We don't know about families and spouses at the moment. That's yet to come from the government, but we know that nothing's going to change immediately for EU citizens after March 29th. But of course, charities should keep an eye on that and look at helping any people within their organisation fill out the paperwork and look at what processes they need to go through when the immigration system is announced. Just lastly then, just a few ideas about what this environment means for charities. For a start, if there's an economic downturn, there is growing need throughout the country. And we've got a crisis in local government of money. So charities are going to be more and more important, as are income problems. If EU funding is cut, there might be less money for charities in the long run. And so charities need to be thinking about getting around that. Staff, of course, as I've mentioned, with the uncertainty around EU nationals, it's important that charities are thinking about how they can help their workforce through any paperwork, any immigration systems. And of course, lastly, is the difficulty in policy making. And this relates to the fact that so much parliamentary time is given over to Brexit and to all the policy issues around such a huge area that there's little or no new money or time for social issues in Parliament. And so the sector needs to really get together and think about new lobbying strategies, a new way of getting social issues onto the agenda. And I'm just going to leave you with this quote from the Charity Finances Group recent reports on a cost-benefit analysis of Brexit. And the fear, this is I think quite representative of how the sector's feeling now, is that we've been told all sorts of things about the opportunities of Brexit, but we haven't heard from the government, certainly from a charity perspective, what the government plans to do with Brexit for charities. We've heard about the UK Share Prosperity Fund and this replacing EU structural funds, but we don't know what that will look like or how much money there will be. And so there's a feeling that charities will bear the costs of Brexit, but not benefit from the opportunities. And so it's important that charities are starting to really think through what no deal and what things like that look like for charities, and how we can carry on speaking to government in a constructive way. So we're going to finish with a poll, and it'd be good, really interesting to see what you think is the biggest issue for your organisation coming out of Brexit. Obviously, we've got the two I've touched on very briefly, one being funding. No secret that EU funds are going to go. The government's talking about Share Prosperity Fund to replace it. We are, with the consultation on that opening later this year, we are still unclear as to what that looks like. Immigration and the workforce, again, we have some commitments towards the rights of foreign citizens, but we don't know exactly what they look like yet. Legal protections, again, there's a lot that's unsaid about what bits of EU law are going to be incorporated, what will change, what in the regulatory environment in terms of procurement and things like that will change for charities. Then, of course, there's impact on the wider economy. Whilst this isn't direct impact on charities, it will, of course, have an effect because we're all operating in the environment we are in. So the results are in, and unsurprisingly, you've all gone for funding. So impact on the wider economy as well. Oh yeah, it's 50%. Sorry, that's just come up a bit later than the other one. Yeah, of course, this is the reality we're working in. It's important to be thinking about that. Whilst we don't know what kind of deal or no deal the government's going to get, it's obviously difficult to predict. But it's very important to be thinking about what we can do and how we can navigate that environment. And so on that note, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Chris, who's going to talk you through the parliamentary difficulties.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So I suppose I probably should start by saying that I think this time last year, we probably thought parliamentary approval might be the easy bit. Getting a deal was going to be tricky, but then when MPs were presented with effectively a choice between deal or no deal, that Parliament would probably approve that and get it through. But the thing that's really become clear over the summer, I think, is that that won't necessarily be the case, and there actually are a lot of concerns in Parliament about what might be put in front of them. So in terms of what the actual process looks like, firstly, of course, what Ben's been talking about is we have to actually agree a withdrawal agreement with the EU. But once we've done that, the government will put forward a motion, and I'll talk a little bit about potential timing of that later. Put forward a motion agreeing for Parliament to agree to the deal, and that needs to then be passed in the House of Commons. It will also be debated in the Lords, but it won't be voted on there. And I think that looks like it's going to be the sticking point, but I'll go into a bit more detail about what that process actually looks like. Once that's been done, the government will then need to pass legislation to implement the withdrawal agreement. There are kind of a few things holding over from the withdrawal bill. So, for example, one thing we'll need to do would be to introduce a transitional period so that we don't exit the treaties until the end of 2020. And then finally, I don't think this will be a particular issue, but there is a sort of ratification process set out in UK law. So theoretically, you can actually then at that point pass a motion to not ratify the agreement. I think that's pretty unlikely, though, that would get anywhere, I think. So I think probably the most important thing to try and understand is different groups in Parliament and the impact that they're likely to have. This is a bit of a simplified version. I saw the Times over the summer actually came up with 14 different Brexit factions. I've just picked up these because I think these are probably the kind of key ones in terms of if you're looking at what way the vote is going to go. So I think it's worth saying that actually the government probably does have the vast majority of Conservative MPs would vote for pretty much any deal that they can get. But then you have these other groups who are perhaps a little bit less predictable. So the European Research Group, which Ben talked about earlier. So theoretically, it's membership of up to 80 Conservative MPs. But in practice, I think the kind of core group of that is much smaller and far fewer than that likely to kind of rebel on this sort of thing, although still, I think, a significant number. You then got this smaller, I suspect, number of pro-Remain Conservative rebels. So our experience over the last kind of year of Brexit negotiations is that's probably between 1 and 15. The 1 is normally Ken Clarke, if there's one. But then I think it's also worth thinking about the opposition as well. So the Labour leadership, yes, they'll be kind of looking at the deal, but I think we've also seen in kind of the way they've approached this, that ultimately their priority is going to be political. What helps them to bring down the government, what helps them to win the next election. So I think we can't really write off those sort of political imperatives when we're thinking about these things. And then there's also a group of Labour MPs who would probably quite like to soften Brexit if they could. and definitely don't want no deal. So I think this could potentially be a sort of swing group of voters in Parliament, but I think they are going to act very cautiously. You only have to look at what's happened to the pro-Brexit Labour MPs who voted with the government on some of the contentious votes prior to summer recess, to see that there is a kind of political cost to potentially keeping the Conservatives in power if you're a Labour MP. So this kind of gives us this sort of supposed scenario of a kind of Goldilocks Brexit that we're taking to Parliament. So it can't be too soft for the European Research Group to vote for, but equally, it can't be too hard to kind of bring those other to remain Conservative Remainers and opposition votes on board. But as I said, I think we have to bear in mind that the opposition, or certainly the official opposition line, could be to vote against whatever, even if we get to a pretty tight scenario in the end. So in terms of the actual process, the motion itself, as I said, once the deal has been agreed, then the government will put forward a motion on the deal. They could do it pretty soon afterwards, or they could leave it later on if they think it's going to improve their chances, which it probably will do. So it has to secure, as I said, approval in the Commons, and will be considered but not voted on in the Lords. Another thing I think just to note is the motion will be amendable. So that does mean that that will give the opportunity to people in Parliament to kind of put forward what I think would effectively be wrecking amendments that would cause the deal to fail, sort of arguing for some kind of renegotiation. And I guess it's questionable whether that would then be the EU would agree to that. So I think it's pretty unlikely you'll get one of those amendments, just because, as you'll see, it's been really hard for enough people to coalesce around one type of Brexit. I think equally it will be just as hard for people to kind of agree to one kind of renegotiation. And I think people will probably want to be a bit more specific. So the numbers on this, we have a narrow Conservative and DUP majority. So in theory, if everyone, all the Conservatives and DUP vote with the government, then a deal should get through. But it's pretty tight, and so we know that effectively the figure is going to be around 7 Conservative or DUP rebels need to vote down the deal if all of the opposition MPs vote against the government. So I think given the statements that have been made by various people, Ben talked about a few of them, quite high profile people who you wouldn't necessarily expect to vote against the government, I think it's pretty unlikely that you'll be able to do it with just Conservative and DUP votes. So I think realistically the government will need opposition votes to pass a deal, unless something pretty major changes in terms of the kind of deal that we're expecting to be put before Parliament. So what happens then if Parliament says no? Well, this was part of the Withdrawal Act that was passed, which kind of set out these mechanisms that would force the government to kind of consult with Parliament on the deal. So if there is, if the Commons votes against the motion to agree the deal, the government would then have to issue a statement. I think it's within 21 days, setting out their sort of revised approach. That will then be put forward for a debate on that statement, so people will be able to have their say on the government's new approach. The other thing that government could do would be at some point in future to table further motions, and they can, ask the question again to Parliament whether they agree with the deal or not. There's probably a limit to how many times they could do it, and one thing to say is if Parliament has rejected a deal, is it realistic to them for the government to then put it in front of Parliament again, perhaps later down the line when it could very easily become no deal. But I think realistically that's going to be quite tricky, and it might be that it's actually quite hard to renegotiate at that stage. So if it does get passed, then we get this legislation, which I'll talk about briefly. So only introduced if Parliament approves the deal, and that will implement the withdrawal agreement, as I said earlier, including things like transition until the end of 2020. So I think the one thing to note here, it should be pretty straightforward if we've agreed a deal, but remember that, like all legislation, it will be amendable. So it is possible for people who are dissatisfied with the results of the motion to use these delaying tactics. So when the withdrawal agreement went through, we saw 500 amendments at committee stage in both the Lords and the Commons. So you can see there's a lot of scope to kind of slow things down, make life difficult for the government, even if not actually stop anything at that stage. So we also were talking before the summer quite a lot about this idea of meaningful vote. So this is something else that was put in the Withdrawal Act. So I think what it was designed to do was ensure that Parliament would have some kind of say if the government decide that they want, they're actively seeking no deal, or they're accepting that there's not going to be a deal. So this will kick in on 21st of January, I think, where if nothing has been agreed at that point, the government will have to put forward a statement setting out their kind of current approach to leaving the EU. So in practice, they could lose that. There could be people who, particularly if they're saying it's not going to be a deal, that's something they could lose. But of course, it won't be binding in two senses. It's not a binding vote in Parliament, but also the terms of Article 50 are, if we haven't agreed something by 29th of March, then we will kind of fall out of the EU anyway. We won't be part of the treaties. And then the other thing is, I think if we're going to get the kind of political crisis, this might be the sort of trigger point for that. So if we really do get a sense of the Conservative Party being particularly unhappy with the approach being taken by the government, this is kind of where you could see some of the triggers happening. I think one thing just to touch on fairly briefly, but which I think is really important. So over the summer, there was quite a bit of coverage saying, well, look, there's a majority of MPs in Parliament who are opposed to no deal, will vote to stop that. So surely no deal won't happen. But the problem with that is you're never actually really able to vote to avoid no deal. As I mentioned, in terms of Article 50, if we don't actually agree a positive agreement, then it will be no deal anyway. So there is no kind of mechanism for you to specifically avoid no deal. The only way to avoid no deal is to actually vote for the deal that the government puts forward. So the last thing I want to talk about is some of the tactics very briefly. We talked a bit about the government might try to push things quite late. I think the later they do it, probably the better. But you've got to remember that the political situation will be possibly very similar, and there might not actually be much difference. You still have that issue with you have to pass a deal. The opposition might not want to talk about it. And also the fact is, if you are leaving things late, there is that danger of kind of greater uncertainty anyway. So how much better than that no deal is possible? So it's probably the big question. I think the most important question at this stage will be what the politics look like. So would the public mood be such that Labour fear being blamed for no deal? I think at the moment that calculation would probably be no. There's an expectation the government would be blamed for any fallout. But clearly that's something that could change in the new year. And I think if there was an expectation that would be a political problem for Labour, and they could potentially vote for a deal to avoid no deal. So I think what this means overall is that essentially no deal is certainly plausible. So you should be planning for it. So we've got one final poll before we go on to Q&A. And we were just really interested to know whether organisations have done any planning for no deal. So it's certainly something that we think is important and you should be thinking about. So at the very least, your board should be having some kind of discussion about what the impact might potentially be on your organisation and what you'd kind of have to do in the event of no deal. So we'll just wait for your votes to come through. And yeah, let's okay, so yeah, I mean, it's not a massive surprise to me. I think that that is quite heavily no. But I'd certainly encourage everyone to kind of be talking about it and thinking about, you know, what impact it's going to have on your organisations. Okay, just a couple of things before we move on to Q&A. Lots of people are doing lots of really interesting work on this, so we're going to share the slides with all of you. We've included a few things, so Institute for Government, UK and a Changing Europe CFG reports. I think Ben mentioned most of those that are worth looking at. Very briefly as well, just to let you know, we've got a few things coming up. It's still not too late to book on our campaigning conference, which takes place on Monday, and we've got a few other things coming up as well. But I will move on to questions because we've got a few things to get through. I think this is one for Ben. So I've talked a bit about the UK side, but what processes does the EU need to go through to kind of agree the deal on their side and with the EU 27?
So there's kind of two layers of politics. That obviously the actual ratification of the deal from the EU side is relatively simple in that they put it back to the EU Parliament, and the EU Parliament votes. It will need a unanimous decision. I think beyond that, though, there's all sorts of complicated politics because it's very easy to view it from a UK point of view, but the EU don't want us necessarily to go out with no deal either, economically, because it doesn't make sense for anyone. So top line answer is it's quite simple. It goes back to its Parliament. The UK takes part in its last summit in March, after which EU summits take place without us. But within each country there will be fairly febrile discussions about what they vote on and how they vote. It's worth looking at the Institute for Government's recent report on the interests of the EU 27 because it goes through country by country, taking a look at what each country's concerns about any particular deal or no deal are.
Thanks. So yeah, I've got another one which I think is for you, Ben. Do you know if Brexit has impacted on charities who are bidding for EU funds? So have we kind of got any figures on whether there's been an increase, decrease, or do we just not know?
We don't know yet. As I said, I think at this point it's starting to drop off because as we approach the deadline and therefore the next round of funding, but also as we approach a potential no deal scenario, I know there's a lot of nervousness to apply for EU funding from a lot of charities I've spoken to. And as I mentioned very briefly earlier, the big message I'd give out is absolutely do carry on bidding into those funds. If you are successful before March in accessing those funds, the government has pledged to underwrite them, and for the government to go back on that would be pretty galling, so I'm sure that won't happen. So I think there probably has been a slight drop off, certainly in as recently as the last few weeks. But as I said, I'd really encourage people to carry on bidding into those funds.
And I've got a related question here as well from Stephen. On getting a recommendation to keep applying for EU funding, but actually if we're in a no deal scenario, how do you think that Treasury's underwriting is actually going to work in terms of timing of payments and being subject to reporting? So will Treasury kind of essentially act as if it was Commission, or will actually the rules and process vary somewhat, which I guess we don't quite know? But
no, I mean, I wish I could answer how the Treasury is going about its business, but sadly I can't. I think it's important with that question. It's kind of a really useful question. It's really important that we talk to government, particularly in light of the Share Prosperity Fund, because I think it will give government a real wake-up call from the sector as to how the sector accesses funds, not just that it accesses funds and how much money, but how that money is delivered. And with the review on LEPs, local enterprise partnerships, the hope from the government is that they'll be more efficient in the distribution of funds. So I think that, no, I can't necessarily answer that question directly, but I certainly hope that through the consultation, the sector is able to say, this is, in the event of no deal, this is how we need funds that were previously from the EU to be administered.
Okay, I think this is probably one for me. So is there time to make necessary legislative changes if we don't have a transition period? It sort of depends, really. I think in terms of actually putting stuff through Parliament, you can often, especially if it's things that we've already agreed can be made through secondary legislation through the Withdrawal Act, you can kind of almost make enough parliamentary time to make it possible, and you can probably do that even with the really big bits of legislation. You can kind of have late sitting hours and do it as emergency legislation. What might be more difficult actually is you're suddenly raising a whole load of questions which we haven't necessarily had to think about because we thought, well, we're going into transition, and so actually do we have the capacity to kind of implement this stuff and even work out exactly what we need to implement on the civil service side. I've got another question here which I think is probably for Ben from James. What do you think might be stopping the 70% from planning for Brexit? Do you think it might be just like lack of information, or so the 70% of our poll that we said they haven't planned for Brexit?
I see. So I thought it meant the withdrawal agreement. What's stopping people? It's a number of things. I think there's lack of information. My impression is that there's also a feeling that there's only so much anyone can do in the environment of uncertainty. You know, it's difficult to plan for the Chequers deal, say, when that seems unlikely. It's difficult to plan for no deal when we don't know quite what no deal means. So I think there's a lot of people who have been quite reticent to do too much, not only because they don't know what's going on, but also because it's hard to know what's going to happen in the future, which is why I think it's now important to start looking at all possible scenarios, simply because we're running out of time on this, and we could end up in a situation where we do come out with no deal, and it's very close now.
I've got another question from a charity who work with EU migrants living in the UK. What sort of preparations do you think they could be making for Brexit?
At this stage, they need to be looking, particularly those technical notices which link to government pages and government information on what it will look like for EU migrants to register in the new system. It's a light touch system they're intending on using. It's intended to be quite straightforward, so just kind of passport, proof of ID, proof of address, and your reason for being in the country. As I said earlier, if a charity has resource to do that, I think it will be good for them to help EU migrants through that system. Although it's simple, paperwork is paperwork, and it is a bit bureaucratic. And say if English isn't your first language, it might be helpful for an organisation to kind of shepherd employees or people they work with through that.
Okay, I think yeah. So this is a question I didn't quite get onto, and I probably should answer. Is there going to be a second referendum? At this stage, I think probably not. There certainly kind of isn't the political support at the moment. Of course, we're going to be in quite a febrile period, I think. So I guess things could change. And certainly, as we kind of, I certainly think that those who are already proposing a referendum on the deal will kind of see if we're in a position where we're trying to agree something last minute. I think that will see that they'll see that as their opportunity to potentially use that to go for a second referendum. So I'm not expecting, and particularly I think it's a tricky one for the Labour leadership. I think everything they've really done has been about trying to kind of avoid being seen to block Brexit. I guess it might depend a bit on public opinion, but I suspect they'll probably hold that line until they absolutely have to, I think. So I suspect not, but it's probably become a bit more likely just as things have become a bit more fraught. Here's an interesting one for you, Ben. So the fact that we've got these difficult negotiations, how do you think that's going to impact our ability to make future agreements with the EU after we've left, and particularly if we do find ourselves in this no deal scenario?
In theory, it shouldn't. In terms of the legalistic angle, we will enter into deals with the EU in the future as a third country, and our treatment legally won't be any different to how a third country is dealt with, which is obviously different to how we deal with them now because we're a member state. Politically, of course, that's a different matter altogether. for two reasons. First of all, the EU might view us differently, having taken the active decision to leave, but also because changes, not necessarily changing our administration, but changes in the politics of our country might mean that our attitude towards the EU, our dealings with the EU is different. I think that's something I would emphasise really with all of the answers, is that the difficulty in all of this is the shifting political ground. I think, as Chris said earlier, a year ago, no deal wasn't really on the radar so much. Going back to the question I was asked earlier, lots of people haven't done planning because a year ago, charities and lots of organisations throughout several sectors didn't see Brexit as top of their to-do list because it looked like we were going to have a different outcome. So it's the shifting ground that is important to bear in mind in all of this.
Another one for you, I'm afraid. So this is from Greg. So Greg has a question about technical notices and kind of what that means. So he said the technical notices don't actually have much practical detail within them. And the EU is in a position where it kind of knows how it deals with third countries. But he kind of thinks the UK seems to either be preparing to blame the EU or to kind of stall on what they need to do. So is there something that the third sector can do and should be doing to raise concerns about that?
Nothing more than what I've said already. It needs to be doing its own planning, but as I said, it needs to be talking to government where it can. It can, as I said, those routes are slightly different before because the policy-making environment is slightly different. But we can look at different ways. We can look at APBGs. There are APBGs now dealing with charity, and a new one dealing with post-Brexit funding. We can identify organisations and indeed MPs who do have an interest in these things in order to engage government if the sector is not able to engage government itself in the most direct way.
Yes, and I think there is kind of so in some ways, business groups are kind of having these conversations, aren't they? And very much kind of looking to kind of influence these things on the inside. It's interesting. We did have, I think Dominic Robb specifically mentioned charities in terms of announcement of no-deal planning, which is perhaps something that we haven't necessarily had before. This question I think comes up every time I do a webinar, so I suppose I should do it. Is there going to be a general election? And particularly if the deal is rejected, how likely is it there'll be a general election? I mean, it's possible. I think the difficulties around a general election in those circumstances would be, it doesn't really solve the problem necessarily. I mean, it could do, but in practice, not much is necessarily going to change. It looks like you'd get a pretty similar result. And then the other thing is that because we have the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, effectively the governments, say Conservatives, DUP, have to kind of vote for this and vote in this position, and with quite a strong risk that they'll lose power, and also put Jeremy Corbyn in number 10, which is not something that I think either Conservatives or DUP want to do. Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for with questions, but we have got our contact details there. So if you have any questions that we weren't able to answer, feel free to get in touch with us. And also, if there is anything we can do in terms of, actually, we'd be kind of interested to hear kind of what you're doing. If there's anything we can do in terms of advice or presenting some of these challenges in terms of the planning you're doing, we're very happy if you want to get in touch with us. Okay, thank you very much for joining us today. Bye.